Well, I am the grandniece of Donaldina Cameron, and I think she must have been almost 80 when I was born. We did live in the same part of Palo Alto. She'd retired down there. So I heard a lot about her life. We'd go over to her house for birthdays and Christmases and other events. So we saw quite a lot of her. She told stories. She told stories about, you know, the 1906 earthquake and about, you know, her life.
Could you hold the mic
closer, okay, there. She told stories about, you know, her life in this area, and you know, it was interesting. But you know, she was very elderly, but very kind. She loved children and was very nice to us. And I guess, you know, I knew a little bit about a Cameron house. We had pictures of my dad sitting on the front steps out here when he was a little boy. So I knew a bit about it, and came here maybe once or twice, but didn't know in detail about, you know, all the things she did until I grew up and you know, learned more. Right next door, she lived in a white house. Right next door was a smaller house, and that's where Teen lived, Teen Wu. And she was just another aunt to me. You know, you're a little kid, you don't know the difference. So they were both my aunts. And Teen was wonderful. She taught us to count in Chinese. She gave us chopsticks and taught us how to use them. She was, yeah, a wonderful aunt as well. So, yeah, that's, you know, I grew up in California, and then, you know, my career took me elsewhere. So now I live in Boulder, Colorado.
Thank you. Doreen? Tell us about your connection to this place. What we didn't fail to mention was that you've sort of become a historian, an archivist in the last decade or so. Tell us something about that.
Well, first I'll tell you my connection to Cameron House, which I didn't know. My sister and brother came over when they were 4 and 5 years old from China. And they went to Angel Island, but they stayed in Angel Island for only a week because they were given passage by Miss Cameron. And I didn't find that out till I did some research into my own history. Yeah, it was amazing. My connection to the history of Cameron House was that when I was director of Cameron House, I knew you never could have time to do anything. To look up the history for somebody in the book. And so I vowed that when I finished working at Cameron House, I would do that. And so a year after I graduated, what I was going to say, I spent time putting together a dossier of Cameron House and writing the history.
Okay. Julia, tell us how you came upon all this.
I'm happy to. I had never been to Cameron House. I didn't know about Cameron House, even though I'm also a local girl. I was born and raised in the Bay Area. But I came across an account by Donaldina Cameron, first-person account of her leading that group of 60 girls and women across the rubble and the disaster zone in April of 1906. And her account was so vivid that I thought to myself, why don't I know more about her? And so I started thinking, well, let's figure out who was she? And eventually that led me to the wonderful Doreen, because Doreen was the keeper of the history. And Doreen, you and I met many times over the last 5 years. And Doreen, with the help of other scholars, but particularly Judy Young, was very involved with organizing a lot of this material. And so we went through some of the case files and some of the background material, but also Doreen and I went to some of the great special collections at Stanford, and we went to Berkeley, and we went to the Bancroft Library. And it was a bit like a treasure hunt. And I really, you know, one of the most wonderful parts of getting to know Cameron House and getting to know its history, its really inspiring history, was getting to know Doreen. So I greatly thank you and thank the house.
Thank you. You know, when you're doing something like writing a book or making a film, you run into some difficult times. Were there some real challenges along the way that you can recall?
Well, let's see. I had hoped, I mean, I'm a nonfiction writer, so everything that is in my book is based on a primary document, or it's based on some sort of material. And it was very frustrating. I had hoped that I would find more material that would give me insights into particularly Dolly Cameron's heart, what she was really feeling. And I found a few hints of that here and there. We had a few letters. She wrote, your great aunt wrote a letter to, must have been, I can't figure out, it must have been your second cousin maybe, describing the earthquake, and that's why we have some of her accounts of what the experience was like when she was living in San Anselmo on the grounds of the San Francisco Theological Seminary. So we know how difficult that experience was for her.
Yeah. The story she always told, maybe this is a story she only told to little kids, but she tried to make it funny. And so here they are walking across San Francisco, you know, fires and, you know, really scary times. And they all had their bundles. She'd had them wrap up their stuff in a bundle and carry it. And she said they got to some hill, and I don't know if it was her idea or the kids' idea, but they started rolling him down the hill. And it just sounded hysterical to me. I thought, you know, it was a really fun time. Reading your account of it, it doesn't sound so fun, but... And then when she got over to the Marin County, my understanding was that she was connected to my namesake, Catherine, her sister. And Catherine, you know, Aunt Catherine, Aunt Kathy was over there somewhere, but that doesn't come out in your book, so maybe that was something that I heard, but maybe not so. And I don't know, Doreen, if you know.
She was San Anselmo.
Yeah. But I think, yeah, and I think my namesake was over there somewhere, working in some institution, so.
Well, and Harry, it was so fun to talk to you recently about your mother's experience of being part of that group of 60 girls and women, you know, during the earthquake and then going to San Anselmo. And particularly, you mentioned that your mother told you that she'd been warned by Dolly and the other women at the home to stay very close together because there was a fear that the traffickers would try to snatch them back in the chaos of the disaster.
Yeah, that's right. By the time the earthquake took place, my mother was 6 years of age, and you know, her mother had been matched by the staff here. They did a lot of matchmaking here, so all that stuff you find on the internet, that's not new. And they wanted the girls who came under their care to, you know, find someone respectable, someone who would protect them and support them. And of course the girls never completely separated themselves out from the mission. They would they would keep coming back to visit Dolly because, you know, they called her mother. And she was really a surrogate mother for many of the girls. So my mom enjoyed running around through this building, and it really wasn't until I was in high school that I realized that I had this strong historical connection here. And that's another story. So.
Well, the other thing I absolutely loved is some of the most beautiful photographs of the home and the pre-earthquake Chinatown came from a German photographer named Arnold Gente. And you were telling me that your mother remembered that he used to pay the girls in the home. He'd give them a nickel photograph or something like that? Yeah, I didn't know that. That was very...
Do you have some insights on Arnold Gente? Yeah, you'll find his name, Arnold Genthy, a person who immigrated from Germany. He has wonderful black and white photographs, and even though many of his plates were destroyed during the earthquake fire, he had the foresight prior to that to put his other things in storage away from the city. So if you can go on the internet, and you'll find a lot of his photos of Chinatown.
They're in Library of Congress, but they're also on the walls of Cameron House because you put them there, didn't you? Some of those wonderful photographs.
Yeah, when I dug into some of the inactive files here at Cameron House, I found a number of photographs and negatives of early Chinatown. And we established a very small dark room downstairs, and that was my hobby. And I decided that it would be fun just to enlarge some of these photographs and display them. So if you were to walk through the floor below this one, you'll see those, and you're certainly invited to do so, at the end of this event. Doreen, why was it so important for people to know, to learn about their past? Give us an example of some of the requests you received.
Well, many of the requests I couldn't find. The girls had gone through so many names. Every time they were sold as a slave, they were given a different slave name. So getting the name from the parents, from relatives who came afterwards, were difficult because they knew not their slave names, but a new name they adopted. And so I would say about 1 in 10, 1 in 20 I would find. And so it was difficult to find people's stories. But some stories, there was a book this big that had the first 500 slave girls or Mujai, and they, some were very large in content, and others were very small. So it was by luck that Russell Lowe called me, and he was at across the street. He was 933 Sacramento, and he told me enough of his story that I was able to find it. And that was an interesting story. She ran away, she was captured by the police, brought back to Cameron House, but she left it saying that she was 19, and so she got to go free.
Thank you. Would you like to add to that, Julia?
Well, I can only imagine. I'm starting to get these wonderful letters from people saying, I just read your book and I realized that my grandmother came through Cameron House and she never told me anything about it. And can you help me? And generally I think, well, we've got to get in touch with Doreen about that logbook. But it's very interesting, and kind of what you were saying earlier, Harry, about how grandmothers didn't want to talk about coming through the home or the circumstances in which they came. And, living with the material for so long and writing this story, you asked about the challenges I faced. And some of those stories were very, very sad. But I found it more helpful in moving forward to frame it as a story of a courageous group of activists. It started with the women who founded the home, and then it expanded to the Chinese aides and the women who stayed here to work, and of course the volunteer lawyers, the policemen who helped. There really was a larger group of people who were supporting the fight against slavery in the 19th and early 20th century. And You know, what I'd love to see is, I'd love to see the city of San Francisco put up a statue to Dolly Cameron, your aunt, and Team Fu Wu, or maybe someone else. Oh, yay! And I also like to see this house recognized as a pioneering anti-trafficking organization in this country. All of a sudden, we're talking about anti-trafficking. Well, one of the first groups to do it in the United States were right here. And that's, I hope, will be the contribution of this book, is to say something very special happened here. That's my pitch for today.
There's really something for everyone in this book. And, you know, I like the way you structured the book because the chapters are very short. And I mean, the time it takes you to drink a cup of coffee, you finished another chapter. You felt like you accomplished something. You know, another cup of coffee, another chapter, and it gets you through the book pretty fast. But you know, if you were to make a movie, a Hollywood movie, everything that you needed, for your film is right there. It's so dramatic, but at the same time, it was so real, and because these things actually happened. You have some photos that, would you like to project those photos and comment on those?
Sure, we could do that. David, could we get him back up?
Give me about 30 seconds.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe we could talk through some of the images, and I bet that Doreen and Kathy and you would.
Sure.
I'd like to point out something too that was such a thrill for me, which was receiving Kathy's book. Kathy is a professor of anthropology at the University of Colorado Boulder, and her most recent book is called Captives, and it was dedicated to Auntie Wu, which I thought was so touching. So, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I'll have to edit myself because this is a subject that's I've been studying for about 15 years. But I started looking at captive women as being a sort of a vector for bringing in new ideas into societies. And when you start looking around the world, you find that young women are taken captive everywhere you look. And I was looking mostly at small-scale societies, like the tribes of the Northwest Coast, the tribes of the Southeast, South America, even Europe. It was very, very common. And so this is, what was going on here was a piece of this bigger view. One thing that startles me is that the statistic is that 200 years ago, 3/4 of the world's people were slaves, serfs, or indentured servants, and now it is way less than 1%, still almost 40 million people. But anyway, so, I'd always known that that's what my Aunt Dolly did for a living, and it was so, interesting to sort of look around the world and see how it fit into this larger picture of captive taking. Women and children were the most common victims of that. So.
Thank you.
David, is there a way to click, should I just ask you to click through it, or is there a clicker?
Okay.
Would you want to sit?
There are a lot of images. Okay, so let's see. Let's go down to the next one, please. Okay, so this is, of course, the door you walked in today. I took this picture. I think there was somebody from Cameron House who propped it open, and you can just see the shadow of his face in the background. But, of course, this is what the house looks like right now, and it really hasn't changed very much since it was rebuilt in 1907, 1908 after the earthquake. And most of you probably know that one of the most distinct things about the architecture here is the clinker bricks. Does everybody know what clinker bricks are? Clinker bricks, if you go outside, I want you to touch the outside of the building because they are molten bricks, and they were salvaged after the 1906 earthquake. And so there are buildings all over the older parts of San Francisco made of clinker bricks, and this is a very distinct one as well. Could you go to the next one? Let's skip that one. Okay. This is a photograph from probably the 1870s, 1880s, And this is what Chinatown looked like before the earthquake. And it doesn't look like anything that resembles today. Mainly wooden tenement buildings. It was the most dense neighborhood in San Francisco, roughly 12 square blocks or maybe 16 square blocks, depending on how you counted it. It had by far the highest concentration of people living there in the entire city. And as we all know, that in the 19th century, early 20th century, most of those people were men who were living there. And thus there was a tremendous demand for women and for sex. 1870s, there was a passage of the Page Act which excluded Chinese women from coming into the country for the fear that they were prostitutes. 1882 was the first of what turned into a series of exclusion rules against the Chinese that were passed by Congress. Could you go to the next slide? This is an illustration of Chinatown at the turn of the century and illustrates what was sometimes described as a bachelor society, a predominantly male society. Could you go on to the next slide? This is one of the most famous images of a prostitute in Chinatown. She's very, very young. She's perhaps a teenager, 12, 13, 14 years old. It comes from the Bancroft Library. And there were census takers in the 1870s, and by their count, they found that something like 70% of the girls and women, the females who were living in Chinatown, were somehow involved in the sex trade, and specifically were probably forced into prostitution. Could you go to the next one? This is an illustration of, it's hard to see, I apologize, but it's Heathen Chinese. It's a famous and terrible poem by Bret Harte that kind of illustrates the anti-Chinese sentiment at the time. And that's a picture of Caucasian men throwing a Chinese man up in the air. It's a very violent picture. Could you go to the next one? Great. Now this didn't take place very far from here. This is an image, a lithograph of something that took place in the Civic Center in San Francisco. This is known as the Sandlot Riots, and this was a famous riot led by Dennis Kearney, who was the head of the Working Man's Party, the white party at the time, that resented the Chinese supposedly for taking jobs. And as you can see on the left-hand side, no Chinese cheap labor for us. So there was a great deal of violence against the Chinese during this period of time. In Los Angeles, a few years earlier, 18 Chinese men had been lynched. But there was really violence across the West. Could you go to the next slide, please? This is a photograph of an alley. Could you go to the next slide? Now, this is the house that those courageous group of women who who objected to the social wrong that they saw, which was the treatment of Chinese women at the time, they raised the funds and they bought this house. So this was the original house that stood on this spot at 920 Sacramento Street. And it's a little grander than the house that's here now. You can see the cupola. You can see the girls standing on the steps over there. Joyce Alley, it doesn't appear that there's a building on the other side of Joyce Alley. But of course, this is the home that would be destroyed in 1906. Before that time, it would house somewhere between 50 and 60 young girls and women at any one time. So could you go to the next one, please? Thank you. This is a wonderful photograph. Actually, Kathy, this came from your family collection, from the attic or the trunk of materials that you eventually donated to the Bancroft. But there's Dolly, Kathy's Aunt Dolly, who's in the middle with the big black bow. And this is back in the day when she was a young woman and was living on a ranch in the Central Valley. And, well, actually, not the Central Valley. It would have been Lucky Baldwin's ranch, La Puenta. Yeah. And she had a broken engagement, so when she arrived at 920 Sacramento Street, she thought she was coming to teach sewing. And she quickly realized that this was a lot more than perhaps she had realized when she took the job.
Do you want me to say who
Yes,
the other people are?
yes, please.
All right.
So, this is my grandfather here. I should say my brother's in the audience and his wife. Scott, my brother Scott Cameron and his wife Carrie Dix. So that's our grandfather. And this guy back here is, his name, we called him Mackie. I think his name was William McDonnell, but he was, just a cousin who hung around with the family, drove my mom around when we were little kids. And this must be Dolly's father. I don't remember seeing a picture of him ever. And I'm guessing that's Aunt Anne, who was sort of the oldest one in the family. And these must be, two of the other sisters. I don't know who. And I wondered in your book if that could be Sargent, who was Dolly's boyfriend at the time. I don't know who he is. I definitely know that's Mackie, and that's our grandfather.
Shall I keep going? Would you like me to? Yes. Okay, we'll keep on going. We'll stop at some point. This is probably the most famous map of Chinatown. It was a state, I think it was a state legislator, and he came and he wanted to do a study of vice in Chinatown. It's known as the Farwell map, and I think it dates back to, 1885, sorry, I got it wrong. But Farwell headed up the committee, and he went house by house in Chinatown and pointed out where the brothels were, where the gambling houses were, where opium was being smoked. And remember, prostitution was not illegal at that time, and opium wasn't illegal either. So let's go to the next one. This is a remarkable character that I had so much fun learning about. This is Ing Poon Chu as a young clergyman in Los Angeles. And his story is such a wonderful story. He was the first Chinese graduate of the San Francisco Theological Seminary. He ended up marrying a young woman from Cameron House and decided eventually that he could be more effective in fighting for Chinese civil rights by becoming a journalist, becoming a newspaper editor rather than being a minister. So he quit the clergy, and he came up to San Francisco and started the Chung Se Yat Po, which is the Chinese Western Daily. And he was a great friend to the Home for many, many years and supported feminist causes, civil rights. He traveled around the country. He was nicknamed the Chinese Mark Twain because he was such an effective orator. So, next one, please. This is Doreen, could you explain who this is? I can't see you pronounce that word.
She's a Muijai. Before they became prostitutes, if they were 5 to 12, they were called Muijai.
And we don't actually know who this girl is. This is a postcard. So images like this were shared and were commercialized in some ways as well. If you could go to the next one, please. Oh, this was an Arnold Genthe photograph. He called it, I think, Unruly Hair. He had such a funny name for this photograph. Girl with unruly hair. Could you go to the next one, please? This is Donaldina right around 1895, and I just love this photograph so much. We don't know who took it, but you can see she's quite the proper lady in her veil and her gloves, and you can only imagine. You never see photographs of her in such finery after she joins the home and starts the fight. So, next slide, please. This is just something I loved, which was a photograph right around the turn of the century of Chinatown after dark. It comes from the San Francisco History Center at the Public Library. Could you go to the next slide, please? This is a very famous criminal in Chinatown. He had the nickname Little Pete. Is anyone familiar with the, yes, a few people had heard about Little Pete. Well, Little Pete was ironically also educated by missionaries. He was fluent in English and Chinese, And he was one of the key traffickers of women from China to the United States in the 19th century. And he found a very clever way to get women over here, and it was mainly through expositions. For example, the 1895 Midwinter Exposition at Golden Gate Park. Well, he got permission to bring in dozens and dozens of women, and within weeks they were not working in Golden Gate Park. They were in the brothels in Chinatown. And Little Pete's story is a terrible one. He was assassinated, and his murderers were never found. I think he was killed in a barber shop, one of the alleys. Next. This is the woman who this hall is named for. Does anyone know about Margaret Culbertson in this group? A few. I know Doreen did. You want to tell us about Margaret Culbertson, or shall I?
Well,
she started the rescue mission. Many people would associate the rescue from Donaldina Cameron, but Miss Cameron started it, and she started many of the extradition of the girls, so the girls could be part of the household of Cameron House, and she was a single. So many of the women who worked here were never married, never had children, and Margaret Culbertson was one of those women. And she ran the home for 20 years. This hall is named Culbertson Hall in her honor. And in fact, the newspapers in upstate New York have paid some attention to this book because they have found a local hero in Margaret Culbertson out of it. So that's kind of neat. She apparently was a very well organized, very gentle, lovely woman, and she died in the 1890s. Could you go to the next slide? This is a photograph from the State Library, California State Library, and it just shows tenement conditions at the turn of the century in California. Could you go to the next slide? This was a popularized, I think it was maybe Harper's Magazine, and if I'm correct, this is about bubonic plague. I can't remember actually. So right around the turn of the century, there was an outbreak of bubonic plague, which was a reflection of the crowded conditions in Chinatown. Bubonic plague, they didn't know it at the time, but it came from the fleas that lived on the rats. And there were outbreaks here, and there was a quarantine, and it was very frightening. A number of people died. So the brave people who ran this home were also, of course, afraid of bubonic plague. Next one, please. This is Donaldina, and this is a young woman who was involved in the case that really raised the state profile, if not the national profile, of this home. It was a case where a young woman had been abducted from the home, brought down to Palo Alto, and there was a series of very shady judicial rulings that kept her out of Donaldina's hands. So eventually they prevailed, and this is 10 years later. She came back, the young woman, and clearly she is thriving. You can see from the pearls she's wearing and the smile on her face. But this was a case that hit the newspapers all over the state and led to some interesting legislative hearings about trafficking, the slave girl traffic. So next, okay, let's skip this one. Ooh, there are so many other stories. This is probably the iconic photograph of a Chinese slave girl. And we don't know who she was. We don't know exactly where this was taken. But it is heartbreaking. It's a heartbreaking story, and of course it's so resonant with what's going on right now with children behind bars. So we'll just leave it at that. Let's next slide. This is one of Arnold Gente's photographs. This is a pre-earthquake photograph of some of the young girls at the home. And now that I know from the Reverend Harry Chuck that his mother was offered a nickel a photograph, it
puts it slightly different. But this is in the Library of Congress, and it was probably taken right outside the home, probably in the yard area somewhere. So next slide, please. This is a photograph of one of the Chinese aides who assisted Donaldina Cameron for many years and died very tragically. And at her deathbed, young Tin Fu Wu witnessed the death, and she was so touched by your Aunt Dolly's sorrow that Tien decided to dedicate her life to helping in the cause of fighting slavery. So, next slide, please. This, we don't know exactly where this one came from. It's also an Arnold Genthe photograph, and it's known as a pigtail parade. He named it Pigtail Parade in Chinatown, but it's quite a adorable photograph. Next. This is got to be one of my absolute favorite photographs, and you can see it later on. It's in the house, and it's framed, maybe thanks to the Reverend Harry Chuck. But this is Tin Fu Wu. This is Auntie Wu, and she's wearing a traveling suit. And you can see it doesn't fit her very well. It's too big on her. But with the help of the home, she was able to go to Philadelphia and attend a very elite boarding school. And then from there, she went to college as well. And this is just such a wonderful photograph of her. So next photograph, please. This must have been taken right after the earthquake. That's Aunt Dolly, your Aunt Dolly. And I don't know who the little girl is. Maybe it's somebody's grandma's here. But you can see there's kind of rubble, and the house has just been constructed. So the same place we're sitting here today. You can see on in the photograph. Next one, please. This is probably one of the best known photographs. So this must have been taken after 1907, 1908, because you see it's the current home that they're standing in front of. And you can see, I think that might be Tai Leung Schultz. Are there any family members of Tai Leung Schultz here today? No. So she was somebody who came through the home, became a Chinese aide. She was known by the nickname of Tiny because she was very short-statured, but of course her first name was also T-Y-I, so it was a kind of play on that. Tiny, in the glasses on the left, at the back row, she's got a big kind of white bow in her hair. She became the first Chinese woman to be hired at Angel Island. And she ended up falling in love with a fellow Immigration Services employee named Mr. Schultz. During that time, it was against the law in California for Chinese people to marry white people. So they went to Washington State to get married. They came back expecting to have their jobs. They were both fired. And she was a remarkably resourceful woman. She had a professional career for many years, and her family is still around, and they recently donated their papers to UC Berkeley. So next slide, please. Oh, you did? So the Reverend Harry Chuck is saying he thinks he sees his mother in that one. Oh, wow.
Do you want to say anything about it?
No. Okay. Next one. Let's skip this one. Let's keep going. Oh, I would love to tell you about one of the most remarkable. Maybe you would like to talk about Yamada Waka.
Well, Yamada Waka was a prostitute in Seattle, and so she escaped through her friend, who was a journalist, and he came down here, but he ran out of money, so he put her to prostitution in the Japanese community. And yeah, and she was there, but she was rescued, and she was brought to Miss Cameron. He committed suicide because of that.
So we found his grave, remember that? Remember? Yeah.
Yeah, so he's buried nearby, and this is such a remarkable end to the story. So Yamada Waka does end up marrying her Japanese tutor, She was tutored by him on Pine Street. They returned to Japan in about 1905, right before the earthquake. She becomes a leading feminist writer in Japan, opens up a home that's modeled on the mission home on Cameron House in Japan, and is eventually invited by Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady, to come visit the White House. And this is a photograph of her in front of the White House wearing a formal kimono. It's just an incredible story, and what was so moving to me is that you asked about the challenges of this project, and one of the challenges is that so many of the girls and women who came through this home didn't leave very much of a record behind. And in some cases, they were ashamed of what had happened in the past. They didn't want to talk about it, but there wasn't much record. Yamada Waka, on the other hand, wrote unbelievably powerfully about her experience of being forced into prostitution, about sex slavery, and then about coming through the home. And so finding, through Doreen, you're the first person who told me about Yamada, finding her trail and the record she left behind was really, really interesting. So, next one, please. Oh, let's go to the next one. This is Ning Poon Chu, the editor, the minister turned editor in his later years. He ended up living in the East Bay with his family. I think he had 5 children. But he continued to edit his newspaper until the 1930s.
Do you want to tell the story of how he moved into his neighborhood?
Sure, you tell.
Oh, well, he knew that they were suspicious that he had 5 children, so he gradually added a child each week, I guess, and until he had all 5 of his children, but by then they were used to him.
This is after the earthquake. Chinatown is razed, just completely destroyed, and a number of Chinese people, well, almost half of the, many people were homeless, and so he brought his family to the East Bay, and he didn't want to settle permanently in the part of Oakland that was the Chinatown. Instead, he wanted to move into what's now known as the Claremont area, which was all white, and so that's what he did. He gradually kind of moved in, and apparently there was a white family's name that was also Chu. He did something unusual. He didn't use NG as his surname. He switched it so it became Chu, and that's how he was able to purchase the home. Next, this is Arnold Genthe. You can see he's holding the camera right there, and this is also pre-earthquake Chinatown. Next slide, please. This is Arnold Genthe with a little girl on his lap. Almost certainly one of the girls who lived here. Next slide, please. Okay, so this photograph is extraordinary. This is a photograph that is taken right up the street, probably 50 yards from where we're all right now, looking down Sacramento Street, and you can see on the left, that's the mission home. This is, again, one of the most iconic photographs of the 1906 earthquake. Next photograph, please. The girls and women and staffers ended up in the summer of 1906 living in a Victorian home in San Rafael that they dubbed the Fairy Palace. This is an example of the Fairy Palace. That home that they lived in still is standing in San Rafael today. This photograph is from the Marin County Library. And your mother might be there.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's kind of blurry. We can't quite figure that out if your mom is there or not. Next one, please. This is also Chinatown. You can just see, or it's kind of, I think we're looking down from Nob Hill onto Chinatown, entirely destroyed in 1906. Next photograph. Again, we're back to the Chung Sayap Po and the crusading editor. Next one, please. This is a photograph of the Barbary Coast around the turn of the century, which was adjacent to Chinatown. Next one, please. This is this kind of a funny story. This is a photograph of one of the first volunteer lawyers who supported Cameron House in its quest. He was a young graduate out of UC Berkeley, and he wrote his dissertation on purity in politics. Does anyone here know the name Boss Roof or Abe Roof? Okay, so he goes to San Quentin. He's on his way to San Quentin for a lack of purity in politics. Okay, next one. This is the one of the interesting challenges was to track down the traffickers. And one of the biggest traffickers in Chinatown arrived shortly after the 1906 earthquake. And this is him. And he came supposedly as a merchant's son. He set up business on Grant Avenue, a hardware store, and he trafficked, we don't know how many, but many, many women. And he was the man who was at the center of what some people called at the time the Broken Blossoms case. And that is really the structure of this book follows the law case against this trafficker. And several of the young women who were residents of the home courageously testified against this man. Let's go to the next one. That's Auntie Wu again, a little bit later in life. Next one.
Can you tell us the fate of the trial of that man?
Sure. Do you want me to tell you a story about the trial of the man? Yeah. Okay, so let's go. Why don't we go forward? Go forward and see if we can keep on going. Keep on going. Keep on going. Nope, keep going. Keep going. Yep, keep going. Next one. Keep going. Keep going. We're almost there. Keep going. Okay, good. Next one. Okay, so I'm going to tell you the story from the beginning, and Doreen, please jump in if you'd like to. But it really starts with this young woman, and she made a very brave dash from a beauty parlor on Jackson Street in December of 1933, when she was left alone by her traffickers for about a half an hour to get her hair done before she was going to see some gentlemen. And she made a run for it, and she ran it originally to the house on Washington Street, which was the Methodist missionary, and then the Methodist missionary walked her over here to Sacramento Street, and she climbed the steps. By that time it was dark, and it was after dinner, so she would have entered the home, and there would have been this smell of Chinese food in the house, and she was greeted at the door by Dolly Cameron and by Tien Fu Wu, and Tien would have spoken to her in Cantonese. And she told an extraordinary story. She was a teenager of being sold and forced into prostitution. And she was willing to talk to law enforcement about what had happened to her and to name names. And so what eventually happened was that the man that she named as the chief trafficker was brought to court in one of the most important trafficking cases in the 1930s. And the first trial resulted in a mistrial, but then another woman came forward, also through the efforts of the home, and she ended up living in the home, and she testified against him as well. And one of the most poignant parts to me was when this young woman made that dash from the beauty parlor to Cameron House, she was carrying a child. That was the child. And that child was born and was healthy, and despite her, everything his mother had been through and all the courage that she'd shown. And the head of the trafficking organization, which to my surprise, he had a syndicate behind him, and it was a very sophisticated kind of organized crime effort, he was deported back to China. So, next slide. This is him. Yeah, this is some of his official immigration records. His name, I forget what was his name here. Leon Chong Po, but he was known as Wing, now I'm forgetting his name, Wing Sun Duck, I think. Next one, please. This is the other woman who testified. It looks like a Hollywood glamour shot. She was very effective in testifying against him, and very, very brave to do it. Next slide, please. This is Dolly and Tien, and I don't know who the woman is between them. Do you know, Doreen?
We think that's Diana Ming Chan. Mother.
Mother.
Okay, next one. Oh, that's a picture of Tai Leon Schultz. And as I mentioned, she took a number of different jobs. She worked at the Chinese Telephone Exchange for a while, and this was a publicity photograph shortly after the passage of the 19th Amendment, which gave many women, not black women, not Chinese women, but many women in the United States the right to vote. And as Judy Young told us, she never drove. So I love that photograph. Next one. This is also, this is the traffickers. This is a photograph that came out of that court trial. And you see how they were arriving on a steamer from China. Next one. This is somebody that you mentioned. I'm going to let you. This is Sergeant Mannion. Sarge.
Growing up in Chinatown, instead of having uniformed policemen, we had the Chinatown Squad. And some of you may remember that you know, they wore suits. And every cop wanted to be on the Chinatown Squad. And I've seen it. They could walk into a store, look at something and say, "Isn't that nice?" And the guy says, "I'll wrap it up for you." But also Sergeant Mannion, he was good cop. He was a good cop, but he was a tough one. And if the kids were misbehaving and and parents were having problems with the kids, he would take them down to the Hall of Justice, get on the elevator, stop the elevator halfway between floors, make the kid pull his pants down, and took out the belt, his belt, and he would thrash him, on the butt. And the only reason why I know this is because one of my former colleagues, Bert Tom, used to get thrashed all the time. So, but we would see Sergeant Mannion coming down the street. He said, "Mannion, Mannion," and everybody split. So.
I think for the paperback edition, I'm going to have to add a few things about Sergeant Mannion. Next slide, please. Oh, that's it. That's it.
Well, you can tell that this was totally unrehearsed, but a lot of spontaneity. But now we come to that place in our program when you can ask the questions, and I'm sure you have a question. We'll bring a mic down to you so that we can pick up the questions.
Working? Hello? Yeah.
In the back.
Mic's up.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I have to get going pretty soon, so thank you for letting me go first. Growing up in San Francisco and having a lot of Chinese American friends, I'm very, very familiar with the term white devil. I can hear Grandma Wong right now, but anyway, white devil, like Buckeye, was always referred to as the Caucasian, so I'm wondering, how did you come to the term white devil's daughters for Chinese young women?
The white devil was a name, a racial epithet that was used to describe Dolly Cameron. She was known as the white devil by her enemies, and she was so effective at disrupting the business of human trafficking that they would call her that. And likewise, her daughters, it refers to some of the residents who she called her daughters, they referred to her as Lomo, or mother.
Good question.
First,
I just wanted to thank you for addressing this subject. I read a previous biography about Miss Cameron, and I think yours is far superior. I really appreciated it, and I found it astounding that you could piece together the first-person stories about the different personalities, and just describing how the family arrived here and checked in on a foggy day from the wharf to the hotel that was down on Battery. It was just
Thank
very
you.
poetic. And I spent many hours in here on Sundays and on the weekends, and I look at it all looks so much more different. And I remember reading in the book about how they started to walk over towards Van Ness Avenue because the fire was coming up this way. So now when I look up this hill, I know, it just has a whole different meaning because Van Ness at that time was known as the Broad Street, the wide street where the fire stopped. And then I know after the fire stopped, they all went back down to the wharves to cross. So I thank
exactly
you.
right.
I thank you for addressing and writing this book. I loved it. I didn't want it to end.
Thank you.
We'll get to that other side just a little bit. Some hands and
Hi, Julia. I've been following you because I love the book so much, and I'm the one whose grandfather was a furrier. So I was quite shocked when I saw some of the traffickers' wives wearing furs and thinking, oh my God, did my grandfather make those furs for them? But I just want to let everyone know, I sit on the San Francisco Commission on the Status of Women, and I've been sitting on there since 2009, appointed by Gavin Newsom, who was mayor, but now governor. And it is my mission now to make sure that there's a statue of Donaldina Cameron and Tinka Wu. And I really want to invite everybody to write to the Commission on the Status of Women, as well as to the Board of Supervisors and the Arts Commission. Harry definitely knows, and Doreen being commissioners, that it takes the community to get things done and the drive, and we can do it. And I hope that all four panelists are there to do the ribbon cutting. But thanks again so much. And as a lawyer in law school, we used to avoid reading the footnotes. And as Harry said, I went and I scrutinized every footnote. You were so detailed at the references of the names, so I really want to thank you for that. And on a final note, I was named a lead co-chair of the California Democratic Party Platform Committee. I think I'm the first Asian woman. But if you look at the woman's plank, there will be references to Comfort Woman and Muay Thai as a reminder of all the work we need to do for modern day human trafficking. And next Friday will mark another San Francisco collaboration against human trafficking. There's going to be a conference. So every time I mention your book and you, and so hopefully we'll get you out there to sort of cross-pollinate all the organizations.
I'll be there on Friday.
Oh, great, yeah. Great.
I think I saw some questions in the center section. I'm just going to go work my way forward from here. Okay.
You referenced that the house was for women and young girls. What happened to the children, little boys that were born to the prostitutes?
The little boys stayed here till about 5, and then they were, Miss Cameron had to find another place for them. She either sent them to the Presbyterian home across the bay. She eventually got Shepherd to open a boys' home.
Charles Shepherd, that was the place your parents threatened to send you if you were bad, right?
Yeah, it was called Chomei Home, and some of you have heard that. And when we were growing up, and if you weren't behaving, your folks would say, I'm going to send you to, to Dr. Shepherd's over at El Sereno. And then, of course, you change your behavior after that.
Is there any history of mixed race, Chinese, Indian, or else in Cameron House?
Yes. Yes, there were. There were a few women that were mixed race, and one of them.
There's one in the photograph.
Yeah. Oh. Yeah. In one of the photographs, she's clearly mixed race. I can't.
There's a wonderful book that just came out in 2016 called The Other Slavery that's all about Native American people in what's now the U.S. and also in what's now Mexico that were enslaved starting as soon as the Europeans got here.
I have not had a chance to read your book. I'm really looking forward to it. I came across some pictures of my older sibling's mom, and the picture of her was here in front of Cameron House. We do not know anything about her. It was dated 1938, and just wondering if there's a way, I have names on the pictures, if there's a way I could look into finding out more about her. She died in 1949, and so I'm just curious. I'm not sure how to research. I know I've just heard great things about Cameron House, but this is my first time here, and I'm just really excited. So anyway, if there's any lead as far as how I could do some of the search.
1938 was toward the end of the slavery trade, but there were a lot of girls who were left for different reasons, and they were sent to Min Kwang home or et cetera. And you might be able to find them if we know enough of the story. If that was not her real name.
Yeah, I'm not sure. She married
But it's worth trying.
She married my dad in 1939, January 3rd. I have dates on this photo, and there was a company called Howard Boyd Photography. It was on the back of the photo. So I'm trying to figure out how to utilize some of that information to get more information. So, just wondering.
Just looking at the time, I think we're going to have time for maybe a few more. I'm not sure how tight we're going to go to the listed time. But I saw a hand over here.
Well, in your book, you mentioned a little girl that carried eggs on the ferry, and you spelled her name quite differently from what I remember her as Hung Mui.
Yes.
You spelled it differently, okay? I appreciate all the notes you had because it provided consolidation of the history.
Yes.
Why was there a discrepancy when Donaldina Cameron said this Mujai was paid off at $3,400 and Tin Fu said it was $5,000, but you kept it in the book as $3,400. I mean, why was there such a discrepancy?
I don't, I actually can't answer that question. There were a lot of different discrepancies in terms of names, and generally what I try to do, if I had two sources with the same name, I might go with that one. But if you could point out to me, I can make changes and corrections in the paperback, so.
I don't care.
And it would be a miracle if I hadn't made a few errors along the way, so.
I do care that maybe the next book after this would
Sure.
cover people like Mei Wong and Hung Hui Chiu,
Yes.
who continue the work.
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Saw a hand.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Brenda Wong Aoki. Let's just say hi. I really appreciate you doing this. My grandmother was at Cameron House, and she was a mixed race. And for people who were mixed race, it was, I think sometimes they get written out of the history, because I know she was also one of the founders of the first Chinatown Garment Union, but nobody knows it. But she told me that they needed her because she could speak English. And I wanted to also point out my uncles were at Zhongmei. And Zhongmei was really rough because, I don't know if there's any Zhongmei boys here, but you had to dance in blackface, right? To make some money sometimes I mean, these are things that people don't want to talk about because they feel so ashamed, but it was really hard for the boys to get money. There was more sympathy for my mother, who was at Mingguang, because little girls were so cute. But the boys had a hard time making money at that orphanage. So there's just like, I mean, it goes on, but thank you, Donaldina Cameron, thank you for doing this, and thank you all for, finding our research. And as Julie says, it continues, the trafficking continues. So if we all, no matter what color we are, work together, we can all make things better. So,
thank you.
Julia, again, thank you for writing a wonderful book, And reading through it, you can tell the amount of work that was put into this. And I'm sure there was much more that you wanted to add. But if you had a chance to do a redo, and I don't mean for you to spill any surprises for your paperback, but if you were to do a redo, is there anything that you wish you left out or you wished you added? Thank
Sure. Well, we just touched on a couple of them. The other side of Sergeant Mannion, I would definitely include that. May Wong, I would like to include her. She was so important. Doreen, how about you? Anything you see? Or Kathy?
Well, I just think many of the stories are very unique. They are not, some are not documented, but Julie documented the ones that were well documented. So I think that the untold stories are the stories that need to be heard somewhere, sometime.
I was just going to ask a quick question about your sources. On the way over here, my sister-in-law, Terry Dix, was asking, they just got back from Scotland, and was asking about the archives in Inverness, Scotland, that you, what's there? I mean, it sounds like they're everywhere.
I need to, okay. So,
I did go up to Scotland also and went to the Highlands Archive Centre to try to track down your family's roots at Drome Farm, and I'm probably mispronouncing it. It's Dream is how you pronounce it.
They went there too.
Oh yeah. So I did find the archivist did help me find the plot of land and whatever the official documents were, and I'm happy to share that with you. But really not too much more about it. So it was a great excuse to go to Scotland.
Well, I think it's.
Are there any other questions in the house? I believe Dorothy Kwok wanted to have the last word.
Okay.
It was her request.
Okay, polka dot.
I know that Harry's too modest to say anything, but he has become a filmmaker. And it was mentioned earlier, Chinatown Rising with his son Josh. So it will have another showing here in San Francisco. Correct me if I'm behind the times of the internet, but on September 26th, it will be in Oakland, correct? At the Piermont Theater at 7 o'clock.
Wow, that's
Chinatown Rising. And then October 10th, it will be back here in San Francisco at the State University, where some of the footage that you took, Harry, part of the civil rights movement that was happening here in Chinatown. So it's an absolute film that is must for those of us who live in San Francisco, and especially in this neighborhood. So Chinatown Rising, if you don't remember the dates that I just said, check it out on the internet. And then we have another celebrity here, Eugenie Chan. She had a play here over a year ago now, I guess, and there's a sequel that's coming up, she tells me, quietly. 2020, that will be also here at Cameron House, and it certainly features the trafficking of girls, what had happened, some of the inside stories of some of the women that were not only here, but here in our neighborhood. So Eugenie Chan is here, so if any of you are interested, you talk to her afterwards, and or keep it in mind, because it will be coming up in the next, within a year, I presume. That's my my PR here.
Okay.